Audible is the leading provider of spoken word entertainment and audiobooks, ranging from bestsellers to celebrity memoirs, news, business, and self-development. Every month, members get 1 credit to pick any title, plus 2 Audible originals from a monthly selection, and access to daily news digests from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, as well as guided meditation programs. Between a full-time job in IT and a full-time job in podcasting, it gets harder and harder to sit down and read the books I'm interested in. This is where Audible comes in. I can listen on my daily commute, relaxing, or while out running errands and still get in the books I've been wanting to get into. You can download titles and listen offline anytime, anywhere. The app is free and can be installed on all smartphones and tablets. Now you can try Audible risk-free with a special 30-day free trial by visiting audibletrial.com/Nerdery and Murdery. That's audibletrial.com/Nerdery and Murdery. Don't let your busy life get in the way of that great book you've been wanting to read. Go get your free trial of Audible today. This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. This is Geoffrey, and we've talked about many times before that I experience problems and struggles with my mental health, and really without a healthy mind, being truly happy and at peace is hard. The good news is therapy does work. It's helped for me, but what is therapy exactly? It's whatever you want it to be. Maybe you're not feeling motivated right now and would like some tools to help. Or maybe you're feeling insecure in relationships at work, or you're not dealing well with stress. Whatever you need, it's really time to stop being ashamed of normal human struggles, and it's time to start feeling better because you deserve to be happy. And now you don't have to worry about finding an in-person therapist near you to help. BetterHelp is a customized online therapy that offers video, phone, and even live chat sessions with your therapist, so you don't have to see anyone on camera if you don't want to. It's much more affordable than in-person therapy, and you can start communicating with your therapist in under 48 hours. So join the millions of people who are seeing what online therapy is really about. It's always a good time to invest in yourself because you are your greatest asset. And there's a special offer to Nerdery and Murdery listeners. You can get 10% off your first month of professional therapy at betterhelp.com/Nerdery and Murdery. That's betterhelp.com/Nerdery and Murdery. Thanks again to BetterHelp for sponsoring this podcast.
You're listening to the sweet, sensual, serendipitous, and soulful sounds of Nerdery and Murdery.
God, I hate you so much. Welcome to episode 108 of Nerdery and Murdery.
Big 1-8. I'm Zig with your Nerdery.
And I'm Geoffrey with your Murdery. Welcome to another week of the highs and lows, the ups and the downs, the good and the bad, the nerd and the murd. Zig, I will let you take over on the nerdery side of the house.
Sweet. Today we're going to talk about Malibu Comics.
All right.
Malibu Comics Entertainment, Inc., also known as Malibu Graphics, was an American comic book publisher active in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Best known for its Ultraverse line of superhero titles. Notable titles published by Malibu included The Men in Black, Ultra Force, and Nightman. The company's headquarters was in Calabasas, California. Malibu was initially publisher of record for Image Comics from 1992 to 1993. The company's other imprints included Adventure, Aircell, and Eternity. Malibu also owned a small software development company that designed video games in the early to mid-1990s called Malibu Interactive. So, Malibu Comics was launched in 1986 by Dave Ulbrich and Tom Mason with the private financing of Scott Mitchell Rosenberg, who was operating a comic book distribution company, Sunrise Distribution, at the time. Unbeknownst to most people in the industry, Rosenberg was also financing a number of other small comics publishers, Eternity Comics, Amazing Comics, Wonder, Color Comics, and Imperial Comics. Malibu's output began modestly with creator-owned black and white titles. Its first title was David Lawrence and Ron Lim's X Mutants. Malibu is kind of important in the story of independent comics. As I said before, we would talk about a few things before we talked about Image to kind of set the stage. We'll probably also eventually talk about Dark Horse and some of the others, but right now I kind of wanted to center on Malibu because it kind of kicked things off in a lot of ways for the indie movement. X Mutants was a comic book series created by David Lawrence and Ron Lim, along with comics package David Campty comics packager David Campty in 1986. Sorry. It was first published by Eternity Comics and then Amazing Comics, Pied Piper Comics, and finally Malibu/Eternity. Malibu created a shared universe called Shattered Earth with the characters in 1992. Malibu Comics rebooted the franchise with a new continuity. A video game for the Sega Genesis, based on the rebooted version, was released in 1992, being developed by Malibu Interactive and published by Sega of America, Inc. Campiti first approached Lawrence about the project in the spring of 1986. At that point, the comic was going to be titled Young X-Mutant Samurai Humans, as opposed to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. X-Mutant premiered with a first issue published by Eternity Comics in 1986. The affiliated publisher Amazing released an expanded special edition reprint of the #1 that same year, followed by issues 2 through 5. Contractual problems resulted in a 1987 move to Pied Piper Comics, where the series was retitled Lawrence and Lim's X-Mutants for issues number 6 through 8. And that same year, Pied Piper also released a one-shot publication, Lawrence and Lim's X-Mutants micro-series Aaron. A legal dispute followed, and after running out of money for the struggles, Lawrence and Lim surrendered. The title returned to Eternity Comics, which by this time was an imprint of Malibu. For December of 1987 through January of 1988, Eternity reprinted issues 6 through 7 as well as a trade paperback collecting the first of Amazing Comics issues 1 through 3 as X-Mutants, The Saga Begins, also known as X-Mutants, a graphic novel of the Shattered Earth, followed by another trade paperback in May 1988 collecting issues 4 through 7 as the original X-Mutants, Gods and Men. After a legal battle, Malibu/Eternity began a shared universe for the characters called Shattered Earth from 1988 to 1990. Eternity produced X-Mutants, The Shattered Earth Chronicles 1 through 15. The publisher also released an annual publication in 88 and the X-Mutants Winter Special in 1989 from 1988 to 1988. 1989, a solo series for the characters Solo X-Mutants issues 1 through 6 was published by Malibu. The X-Mutants universe was expanded with spin-offs, The New Humans, Wild Knights, and Shattered Earth, both between 87 and 89. Finally, Malibu Comics published a rebooted version of the characters X-Mutants Volume 2, 1 through 18 from 92 to 94 as part of the Genesis universe with Protectors and Dinosaurs for Hire. In 87, after Rosenberg's behind-the-scenes roles were revealed, he discontinued most of the other small publishers, merging some of the Malibu and retaining Eternity Comics as a Malibu brand. At this point, Chris Ulm joined Malibu as editor-in-chief. In 88, Malibu effectively acquired the Canadian publisher Aircell Comics as an imprint, and in 1989 it acquired Adventure Publications. From that point forward, the Malibu brand was used for superhero titles, while Eternity was used for the magazine's line and also for anime-inspired titles like Robotech. Adventure was used for Malibu's licensing titles such as Planet of the Apes and Alien Nation, and Aircell was used for Barry Blair's comics and Malibu's adult line. In 1998, the company also acquired the characters Shuriken from his creator Reggie Byers. The character was self-published from 85 to 88 by Victory Productions. Shuriken was published in 3 limited series and 2 one-shots by Malibu. Later, the character was introduced in the Ultraverse imprint. By this 1989 to 1992 period, the company made a name for itself by publishing a combination of new series, licensed properties, such as the classic characters Tarzan and Sherlock Holmes, and popular television, film, and video game tie-ins. Later, after a legal battle with the creators, Malibu created a shared universe called Shattered Earth. In 1992, heroes from Centaur Publications, a Golden Age publisher whose properties fell into the public domain, were revived in the form of the Protectors, consisting of Airman, Amazing Man, Aura Arc, Arrow, Ferret, Man of War, and Mighty Man. Among others, several of these characters had short-lived spin-off titles of their own. The Centaur heroes and other characters from Adventure, Miss Fury and Rocket Ranger, and Eternities, Dinosaurs for Hire and X-Mutants, plus Dead Clown and Widowmaker were put together in one universe to form the Genesis line. This line, however, had a shorter lifespan. So they made a bunch of games on the Genesis with these characters that went on to be fairly popular games, Genesis titles. Either run and gun, shoot 'em ups. In some cases, there were a couple of fighting games. They were all over the place, but they were awesome. In early 1992, Malibu served as publisher of record for the first comics from Image Comics, giving the upstart creator-run publisher access to the distribution channels that Malibu had. This move led to Malibu obtaining almost 10% of the American comic market's share, temporarily moving ahead of industry giant DC Comics. So Malibu actually got up over DC Comics for a few months in the 1992 period.
Wow.
But by the beginning of 1993, Image's financial situation was secure enough to publish its titles independently, and it left Malibu. But at this time, they were also seeking to capitalize on growing video game markets. Sorry, Malibu was looking to capitalize on this. They merged the video game developer Acme Interactive to form Malibu Interactive. But at this point, they released the Ultraverse line, and it was launched in June of 93. During the boom of the early 90s, roughly concurrent with the debut of publishers such as Image and Valiant, which we have spoken about before, a new superhero line from DC and Dark Horse, Milestones and the Comics Greatest World, respectively. The line was in part intended to fill the gap left by Image's independence. Establishing itself as the first company and as the first to use digital coloring for all its titles, Malibu boasted improved production values over traditional comics, including higher quality paper and a roster of talented and respected writers and artists. Emphasizing the tight continuity between the various series in the Ultraverse line, Malibu made extensive use of crossovers, in which a story that begins in one series would be continued to the next shipping issue of another series. Various promotions of special editions or limited print store followed. The Ultraverse line came to dominate Malibu's catalog. Malibu launched additionally the Rocket Comics imprint for Rock Band Comics in early 1994. Malibu worked with Gold Mountain Entertainment Management firm in dealing with the musicians, while International Strategic Marketing for distributing the line of comic book shops, music outlets, and other newsstands. As sales declined industry-wide in the mid-1990s, Malibu canceled lower-selling series, but their biggest problem was the games division, starting an attempt to break into the video game market, which cost them more than $200,000 a month.
Wow.
Yeah. Nonetheless, the company's assets were still seen as attractive enough to garner interest from DC in the spring of 94. In addition, Rosenberg and Malibu signed with the William Morris Agency. But because Malibu had sufficient market share that an acquisition from DC would make the latter surpass Marvel's market share, Marvel decided to purchase Malibu themselves to prevent this from happening. On November 3rd, 1994, Malibu was purchased by Marvel Comics. To slow down rumors that the Ultraverse titles would be canceled as soon as the deal closed, Malibu claimed that Marvel wanted them because of their digital coloring system. In the middle of the next year, 1995, Malibu's standard bearer, Mason and Ulm, left the company. Marvel did eventually cancel the entire Ultraverse line during the Black September event, relaunched a handful of the more popular titles as well as a number of crossovers with Marvel characters. The Volume 2 series each started with number Infinity issues and were canceled a short time later. Within the Marvel Comics multiverse, the Genesis universe is designated Earth 1136, and the Ultraverse is designated as Earth 93060. Very little Malibu content was published after 1996. So that's a lot of information I just gave out, but I kind of want to break that down. So basically, Malibu started with a couple of creator-owned comics, and then they bought out a bunch of other failing companies, and then they got in bed with Image and kind of got them kicked off. Whereas Malibu basically held on to a large, or at least 10% of the comic share in the United States for a few months in the 1992, 1993 era. And then they wanted to break off into video games, which started costing them a lot of money. And eventually, the comic book market kind of fell in the 1990s because, as we've spoken about before, there were a bunch of profit speculators that thought that they could make their nut by buying a bunch of special titles of comic books, putting them in boards and bags and keeping them in a safety deposit box. The problem that they had was they didn't realize, because this was becoming such a big thing, these comic book companies were publishing thousands of these titles. So none of them were actually rare. So the market fell through, and this hurt the comic book industry across the board. And it happened in very quick succession. As Jeff can speak to, comics were everywhere in 1992 and 1993.
Yep.
But by 1997, they were passé.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very quick boom and bust. And it killed a lot of the small companies. Image was able to stay around because their quality and their output was incredible. Image has gone on to produce some amazing things as well. They did want to bring Ultraverse back in June 2005 when asked by Newsarama whether Marvel had any plans to revive the Ultraverse. Marvel editor-in-chief Joe Quesada replied that, "Let's just say that I wanted to bring these characters back in a very big way. But the way the deal was initially structured, it's next to impossible to go back and publish these books. There are rumors out there that it has to do with a certain percentage of sales, and it has to be doled out to the creative teams. While this is a logistical nightmare because of the way the initial deal was structured, it's not the reason why we've chosen not to go near these characters. There's a bigger one, but I really don't feel like it's my place to make the dirty laundry public." In May of 2012, Steve Englehart suggested in a podcast interview that the reason Marvel will not presently publish the Ultraverse characters is because 5% of the profits from those books would have to go to Malibu creators that are still alive. Marvel editor Tom Brevoort later denied that the 5% was what was holding Marvel back, but was unable to give a real explanation due to a non-disclosure agreement. It has been speculated that Scott Mitchell Rosenberg's ongoing producer deal for all Malibu properties and his alleged personal troubles is another possible factor. Now, I would like to talk a little bit about some of the companies that they bought up in the late 80s and early 90s. Centaur Publications, also known as Centaur Comics, was one of the earliest American comic book publishers. During their short existence, they created several colorful characters, including Bill Everett's Amazing Man. Centaur developed primarily from the comics magazine company Inc. in 1936. Comic book entrepreneur Everett M. Busy Arnold gave financial and other unspecified help to the New York City-based firm, founded by John Mahon and Bill Cook, formerly employees of Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson's National Allied Publications, the primary forerunner to DC Comics. The duo published the premiere issues of the comics magazine in May of 1936 using inventory content from National Allied submissions. One collector historian suggests this was in lieu of pay. Among the comics magazine company's original features was Dr. Mystic, the occult detective, not to be confused with Mr. Mystic of newspapers, the spirit section. The 2-page feature was by future Superman creator Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster and was part of the Dr. Occult continuity. With the same change from trademark considerations, this was the beginning of a serial that introduced the villain Koth and the Seven that continued into DC's more fun comics, 14 through 17 issues also, designated as Volume 2, number 2 through 5. The company's flagship title, the eponymous Comics magazine, premiered with a May 1936 cover date. The comic book series featured the first masked hero in American comics, artist George Brenner's The Clock, in the November 1936 issue. But by January 1938, Ultim was bought out by Joe Hardy, Fred Gardner, and Raymond Kelly's Centaur Publications, which had been publishing pulp magazines since at least 1933. Hardy, Gardner, and Kelly used the base to create Centaur Comics, which began publishing in March 1938. They also drew on the back inventory of stories to fill out early issues with their new titles with reprints. Centaur Publications, Inc. ceased production at the end of 1940, but continued to produce comics under their name, Comic Corporation of America. And then they ceased publication 4 years later, primarily due to poor distribution. But in that period, they created several colorful characters, including Amazing Man, Namor the Submariner, which they sold to Timely Comics, later Atlas Comics, and then Marvel Comics. In 1992, Malibu Comics revived several Centaur heroes, which by that time had lapsed into public domain, except for Namor, which got bought out by Marvel. The superheroes team, the Protectors, Malibu selected R.A. Jones to revamp and write the series, including were Airman, Amazing Man, Arrow, The Clock, and then the Phantom of the Fair, also known as Phantom Man, the Ferret, Man of War, the Masked Marvel, renamed Night Mask, Mighty Man, Prince Zardy, the Eternal Man, and Shark, renamed Thresher, as well as completely original characters such as Arc and Aura. Several of these characters had short-lived titles of their own. AC Comics reprinted a number of stories featuring Centaur characters in their anthology series. They also bought out Adventure Publications. It was an American comic book publisher founded by Steve Milo in 86, based in Fairfax, Virginia, and active from 86 to 93. In 89, it merged with American publisher Malibu Comics to become the Adventure Comics imprint. The company was named for its first book, The Adventurers, and initially published by Canadian comic publisher Aircell. After the first 2 issues, Adventure Publications began publishing independently with strong printing of the first 2 issues, simply titled Adventurers. But by March of 88, the company had 5 titles: Adventurers, Elf Warrior, Ninja Elite, Star Rangers, and Warriors. All of these titles that went on to Malibu were really, really great. Elf Warrior was really good. Star Rangers was good, as was Warriors. And again, if you kind of enjoyed the indie comics because they had some slightly more adult themes to them, they weren't just kiddie stuff. This would have been right up your alley. And again, a lot of this stuff has been in trade paperbacks. You can go out and find it at your used bookstores and things like that. Great stuff, not really expensive. Yes, if you try to buy some of this stuff on Collector's Market and original printings and stuff, some of it can command a fairly hefty price. But some of it is, still out there to be found. Aircell Comics was a comic book publisher founded by Barry Blair in Ottawa, Ontario in 1985. In 1988, it merged with American publisher Eternity Comics, itself an imprint of Malibu Comics. And the late 1980s was taken over by Malibu before ceasing publication in 1994. It was best known as the original publisher of The Men in Black, a comic book which later adapted into a media franchise. The Men in Black comic was awesome. If you're not familiar with the original comic, if you ever watched the cartoon, The Men in Black, it was a lot more like the comic than it was the movie franchise. Aircell blended historical and futuristic fantasy from different cultures as the underlying theme for most of its comic series. It featured high-quality color covers with black and white interiors. Canadian artists such as Dave Cooper, Dennis Beauvoir, and Dave Keown got their start at Aircell. Charles DeLint also scripted several comic books for Aircell in the mid-1980s. Aircell was originally a manufacturer of foam insulation. When the government discontinued its contract with the company, employees Barry Blair convinced the owner to shift the company's focus to comic books, which at that time were experiencing a boom in Canada. Blair ran the publishing operation and Aircell's initial talent lineup, including him, Dave Cooper, Patrick McEwen, and Guang Yap. Aircell released its first book in 1985, Samurai, Dragon Rigging, and Elf Lord, all of which featured line art and style borrowed from manga, which was fairly new to North American market. In 1986, illustrator Dennis Beauvoir and writer Gordon Derry collaborated with Blair to create Warlock 5, which featured realistic mixed media and airbrushing techniques. The Maelstrom series was released shortly thereafter. And then again, a little bit later in the 80s, they came out with The Men in Black, which was, quite huge. I'm sorry, 1990. I thought it was 89. I'm sorry. They released Men in Black, and it was a pretty big deal for Aircell. And then Eternity. Eternity Comics was a California-based comic book publisher active from 86 to 94. First as an independent and then an imprint of Malibu Comics. Eternity published creator-owned comics of an offbeat independent flavor, as well as some licensed properties. One of its most notable titles was The X-Mutants, which we talked about, but also some other ones, Cat Claw, The Jackaroo, and Southern Squadron. Eternity began publishing in 1986, privately financed by comic distributor Scott Mitchell Rosenberg and helmed by Brian Marshall and Tony Ng. One of Eternity's most successful titles was the 1988 to 1994 license of the Robotech franchise. The creators, the Waltrip brothers, began with the direct adaptations of Robotech to the Sentinel script and novels before eventually writing additional stories that expanded the canon beyond the initial 85 animated Robotech episodes and the Sentinels. As the series progressed, the Waltrips began deviating from the Sentinels novels, adding new story elements and new characters. Eternity basically got bought out by Malibu because of the legal battles for the X-Mutants, which when they started the company, they didn't realize Rosenberg was in bed with Malibu and Aircell and everybody else. And toward the end, Malibu stopped using the Eternity imprints, and Eternity's last two franchises moved to other publishers in the middle of 94. Ninja High School returning to Antarctic Press, and Robotech moving to Academy Comics. And I want to say Academy produced them for several more years. But like some of the things that Malibu did, like the slick paper on all of their pages as opposed to just the cover, plus the computer coloring instead of using a colorist, made all of Malibu's stuff pop. It's what everybody uses now. And as Malibu like to point out, the reason they got bought out was because of that process, because they held a patent on it. So yeah, and the comics are, again, they're a little more adult. Some of the Aircell stuff is really adult, a little less for kiddies, but it was a lot of fun. Wasn't real happy with all of the crossover sort of things. My ex-roommate Paul collected a lot of the Malibu stuff. He really liked it. I had a few titles myself. just because I thought the artwork was cool. Plus, they were good stories. In our YouTube playlist, I've listed a bunch of examples, people going through Malibu Comics and pointing some of these things out. I believe there's a story about Malibu itself, sort of a documentary, plus some interviews with creators and some of the other people involved in the setup. But yeah, Malibu was real big in getting the sort of the indie thing kicked off. And they were the publisher of record for Image Comics for their first year, which is no small feat. But yeah, there's some good titles out there. And again, a lot of the stuff you can still go out and find. A lot of the more popular stuff like Nightman and Men in Black got sold off, as well as Elf Lord. So you can go out and readily find it. And some of the other stuff that may not be as easy to find, you can go out to your used bookstores and pick it up. So, dear listeners, if you get a chance, check out some of that Malibu. If nothing else, if it sounds interesting, watch the YouTube playlist. It'll show you some of what I'm talking about here. But that is about it for Malibu Comics.
Cool. Appreciate that trip down another comic book line.
Yeah, it was a bit of a rabbit hole. Sorry.
No, that's all right. It's always a good trip down there. I enjoy listening to it. So with that, we'll step over to the murdery side of the house.
Murder.
For today, I got my information off Wikipedia, All That's Interesting, and The Guardian, and this is the story of the Backpacker Murders.
Backpacker Murders.
So the Backpacker Murders refer to a string of gruesome killings that took place between 1989 and 1992 in South Wales, Australia. The murders were committed by Ivan Milat, who was convicted of the crimes in 1996 and sentenced to life in prison. The Backpacker Murders were a shocking and terrifying series of events that shook the country and the world and they continue to be the subject of discussion and analysis to this day. The bodies of 7 missing young people aged 19 to 22 were discovered partially buried in the Belangelo State Forest, 9.3 miles southwest of the New South Wales town of Berrima. 5 of the victims were foreign backpackers, 3 German, 2 British, and 2 were Australians from Melbourne. Milat was convicted of the murders on July 27, 1996, and was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences, as well as 18 years without parole.
Holy crap, they put him under the jail.
Well, he died in prison on October 27, 2019, having never confessed to the murders from which he was convicted. Ivan Milat was born in 1944 in New South Wales, Australia. He was one of 14 children in his family and grew up in a poor household, and his father was often violent. His father worked on the wars in Sydney after migrating from Croatia after the First World War, while his devoted mother cared for the children. His father, a strict disciplinarian, eventually started a tomato plantation at the family property in Moorebank, Western Sydney, where his sons were put to work. Milat had a difficult childhood and was known to be a troublemaker from a young age. Milat and his overcrowded family grew up in a shack in Moorebank, a suburb, located in the outskirts of Sydney, Australia. The Milat siblings were enrolled in private Catholic schools, but after classes would get into mischief. They were used to handling knives and firearms and spent their afternoons shooting at targets in their parents' yard. And Milat was a well-known delinquent to authorities by the age of 13. He dropped out of school at the age of 15 and began working odd jobs around Sydney. Soon enough, though, his crimes escalated. By 17, he'd been sent to a juvenile detention center for theft, and by 19, he'd broke into a local store. As Milat got older, he was linked to crime for increasing severity. In the 1970s, he was tried but acquitted of raping 18-year-old Margaret Patterson, who had been hitchhiking to Melbourne with a friend. Milat was known to be a loner and was often described by strange or creepy by those who knew him. According to Milat's older brother Boris, who is also the only member of the Milat family who has spoken publicly against him, Ivan Milat showed signs of psychopathic behavior from an early age. When Milat was 17, he allegedly confessed to Boris about accidentally shooting a taxi driver during a stick-up gone awry. The man was left paralyzed from the waist down. Milat was never caught, and an innocent man was subsequently convicted and served 5 years in prison for his crime. Then in 1971, at age 26, Ivan Milat was charged with raping 2 female backpackers, but the sloppiness of the prosecutor's evidence only served to get Milat acquitted. Perhaps having gotten away with this crime, Milat felt he could get away with more and worse crimes. He attempted the rape and murder of 2 more women in 1977, for which he was never charged. I don't know why.
Yeah.
Ivan Milat, go ahead.
They knew what he was up to.
I know. Ivan Milat married a woman 15 years his junior in 1984, but the marriage went south quickly, and as a result, Milat burned down her parents' home in Newcastle. His ex-wife testified against Milat in trial and said her ex-husband was obsessed with guns and known to be violent. Up until the mid-1990s, hitchhiking in Australia was viewed as adventurous and inexpensive, if not a completely safe means of travel. However, unsolved Australian missing person cases, that of Trudy Adams in 1978, Tony Jones in 1982, Naoko Onda in 1987, and Anna Rosa Liva in 1991 led those who still hitchhiked to begin to travel in pairs for safety. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, several backpackers began to disappear. One case involved a young Victorian couple from Frankston, Deborah Everest and James Gibson, who had been missing since leaving Sydney for Confess near Albury on December 30th, 1989. Another related to Simone Schmidl from Germany, who had been missing since leaving Sydney for Melbourne on January 20th, 1991. Similarly, a German couple, Gabor Negabier and Anja Habashid, had disappeared after leaving a King's Cross hostel from Mildura on December 26, 1991. Another involved missing British backpackers Carolyn Clark and Joanne Walters, who were last seen in King's Cross on April 18, 1992. So this is when the backpacker murders began, when 2 British backpackers, Carolyn Clark again and Joanne Walters, disappeared while traveling to New South Wales. Clark, who was 21 from Surrey, and Walters, 22 from Mastig in Wales, met at a backpackers hostel in Sydney's King's Cross and shared a flat there. They had hitchhiked together a number of times in Australia to the small towns of Mildura and Victoria and on the way to Tasmania to pick fruit. When weeks passed without any contact with their parents, the 2 families sprang into action, alerting police in the UK and Australia and using the media to drum up interest in the case. Their bodies were later discovered in a shallow grave in the Belangelo State Forest south of Sydney. The women had been brutally murdered and their bodies showed signs of torture and sexual assault. Walters had been stabbed 15 times, 4 times in the chest, once in the neck, and 9 times in the back, which would have paralyzed her. Clark had been shot 10 times in the head at the burial site, and police believed she had been used as target practice. Suspecting that they would find more bodies in the forest, investigators conducted a search of the area but came up empty-handed, but they were right, and eventually more corpses would be unearthed in the coming year. Over the next few years, several more backpackers disappeared while traveling in the area, and their bodies were later discovered in the Belangelo State Forest. The victims were all young and fit, had been traveling alone or in small groups, and they were all from foreign countries and are often described as adventurous or carefree. In October of 1993, a local man searching for firewood discovered bones in a particularly remote section of the forest. He returned with police to the scene, where 2 bodies were quickly discovered and later identified as Gibson and Everest. Gibson's skeleton, found in the fetal position, showed 8 stab wounds. A large knife had cut through his upper spine, causing paralysis, and stab wounds to his back and chest had punctured his heart and lungs. Everest had been savagely beaten. Her skull had fractured in 2 places. Her jaw was broken and there were knife marks on her forehead, and she had been stabbed once in the back. The presence of Gibson's body in Belangelo puzzled investigators, as his camera had been previously discovered on December 31st, 1989, and his backpack later on March 13th, 1990, by the side of the road in Galston Gorge in the southern Sydney suburbs, over 75 miles to the north. On November 1st, 1993, a skeleton was found in a clearing along a fire trail in the forest during a police sweep. It was later identified as that of Schmidl and bore at least 8 stab wounds. 2 had severed her spine, and others would have punctured her heart and lungs. Clothing at the scene found at the scene were not Schmidl's, but matched that of another missing backpacker, Habschied. The bodies of Habschied and Neugebauer were then found on a nearby fire trail on November 4th, 1993, in shallow graves 160 feet apart. Habschied had been decapitated, and despite an extensive search, her skull was never found. Neugebauer had been shot in the head 6 times. There was evidence that some of the victims did not die instantly from their injuries, and the carnage was nothing like the local authorities had seen before. The killings dominated the news. The series of homicides earned the nickname backpacker murders, considering the killers had targeted tourists hitchhiking their way through Australia. The police initially had few leads in the case, and the killer remained at large for several years. In response to the finds, on October 14, 1993, Task Force Air, containing more than 20 detectives and analysts, were set up by the NSW police. On November 5, 1993, the NSW government increased the reward in relation to the Belangelo serial killings to $500,000. Police warnings were also given, particularly aimed at international backpackers, to avoid hitchhiking along the Hume Highway. And after developing their profile of the killer, the police faced an enormous volume of data from numerous sources. Investigators applied link analysis technology to road and traffic authority vehicle records, gym memberships, gun licensing, and internal police records. And as a result, the list of suspects was progressively narrowed to a short list of 230 and then even to a shorter list of 32. There were similar aspects to all the murders. Each of the bodies had been dumped in remote and bushland and covered by a pyramid of sticks and ferns. Forensic study determined that each had suffered multiple stab wounds to the torso, and many showed signs of sexual assault. The killer, probably a local with a 4-wheel drive, had evidently restrained and spent considerable time with the victims both during and after the murders, as campsites were discovered close to the location of each body. Matching .22 caliber bullets, shell casings, and cartridge boxes from 2 weapons also linked the crime scenes. Speculation arose that the crimes were the work of several killers, given that most of the victims had been attacked while as pairs, had been killed in different ways, and buried separately. However, in 1993, a breakthrough occurred when a British backpacker named Paul Onions came forward and reported an incident that had occurred in 1990. Onions had been traveling in New South Wales when he was picked up by a man in a car. The man offered him a ride, but then pulled a gun and attempted to kidnap him. The driver fired after Onions as he tried to run across the Hume Highway, and eventually he flagged down a woman driver, Joanne Berry, yelling and pleading at her for help, and Berry helped him escape. But Onions' report and Berry's statement about the incident to local police was waved off and forgotten. That was until Onions saw the news about the Belangelo backpacker murders.
Oh my God. So in 1990, this guy's like, hey, this guy picked me up and tried to kill me with a gun. This is what he looks like. This is the car he drives. And they did nothing about it.
Yep.
Okay. I'm with you.
Again, Onions had managed to escape and report the incident to police, but the man had never been caught. Australian authorities flew Onions in from London to Sydney to identify the man who had tried to kidnap and murder him. And out of 13 photos of suspects, Onions identified his almost killer as suspect number 4, Ivan Milat. Milat was arrested and charged with the backpacker murders, and a lengthy trial began in 1995. The trial was one of the most high-profile in Australian history and lasted for several months. Milat was eventually convicted of the murders of 7 backpackers and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He has never shown any remorse for his crimes and has maintained his innocence to this day. And although the killer has been put behind bars, mystery still surrounds the case of the backpacker murders, namely how Milat managed to pull off some of the murders on his own, which has led to the theory that he may have operated with an accomplice like his brother Richard, even though no tangible evidence against him has ever been discovered. To this day, police remain unsure as to whether they've uncovered all of Ivan Milat's victims. They suspect a slew of missing person cases dating back to the early 1970s could also have been his doing. The backpacker murders had a profound impact on Australia and the world. They were a shocking reminder of the dangers that can exist while traveling alone in a foreign country. The murders also raised questions about the safety of backpacking and led to increased scrutiny of the industry. The case also had significant impact on law enforcement in Australia. The investigation into the murders was one of the largest and most complex in Australian history and highlighted the need for better coordination between police forces and greater resources for forensics analysis. And the backpacker murders also had a lasting impact on the families of the victims. The murders were a devastating loss for the families, and many continue to struggle with the trauma and grief of losing a loved one in such a horrific manner. The backpacker murders were a tragic and senseless series of events that continue to haunt Australia and the world. The murders were a stark reminder of the dangers that can exist when traveling alone, and they raised important questions about the safety and the need for better law enforcement coordination and forensics analysis. While Ivan Milat was ultimately caught and convicted, the impact of the backpacker murders continues to be felt today. Again, the case serves as a reminder for the importance of safety and vigilance while traveling, the ongoing need for improved law enforcement and forensic capabilities. The victims of the backpacker murders will never be forgotten, and their families and loved ones will continue to mourn their loss. And the case also serves as a reminder for the need and compassion and support for those affected by violence and trauma, and the ongoing work needed to prevent such tragedies from occurring in the future. And that is the story of the backpacker murders.
Well, thank you for that, sir. I'm glad they caught the dude.
Yeah, me too. Another bad dude that's off the streets.
Yep.
Unfortunately, I think it took him too long.
Yeah. And you think about it too. Australia is fairly empty.
Right.
Different parts. So.
Right. So thank you for that. That takes us to the end of another recording week. As always, you can find our information on nerderymurdery.com, where you can find links to our episode as well as pictures from the items we talked about, as well as links to our YouTube page.
Yes, our YouTube page, where we have a whole bunch of errata and things about the episodes that we talked about, at least the nerdery part. And you can see videos that we like and think are funny as well.
I really appreciate the work you do on that.
Oh, hey, speaking of which, I have a YouTube page out there called Thoughts,
Okay.
or one of the playlists. It's called Thoughts. I'm basically trying to capture the zeitgeist of Generation X.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go in and listen to it, see what you think. I'm looking for songs about us as a generation as a whole. So if you got any ideas, give it a listen or look at the list and tell me what you think.
Cool. Good deal. Please do check that out.
Thanks, sir.
You can also find the link to our merchandise page on our website, where if you wish to show off your Nerdery and Murdery fandom, please do consider purchasing some merchandise. And you can also find the link to our Patreon, where if you wish to become a patron, along with our merchandise, our patrons do help cover the costs of the show, as there are costs that are associated with producing the show and keeping it on the air. So please, we do appreciate each and every one of our patrons.
Please and thank you.
Please and thank you. And as always, please don't forget to leave a 5-star review wherever you can. It really helps us and helps others find our content that may be looking for us. So with that,
I have been Zig with your nerdery.
And I'm Geoffrey with your murdery.
Cue the music.